There are people in this world who carry music inside them like a secret they are afraid to tell. They walk among us every single day, looking ordinary and unremarkable, but inside their hearts beats a rhythm that most of us will never understand. This is the story of one such person, a man named Kenzo, who spent more than 2 decades hiding from his own gift. Was born in a small coastal town where the sound of waves mixed with the melodies of street musicians playing on every corner. His grandmother was the first person who noticed something different about him when he was just 3 years old. She found him sitting at an old broken piano in their neighbor's garage. His tiny fingers were moving across the dusty keys, and somehow he was creating sounds that made sense. Not random noise like most children would make, but actual patterns that felt like they belonged together. She stood there, watching him for almost 20 minutes before he noticed her presence. That moment changed everything. For young Kenzo, his grandmother scraped together every penny she could find and bought him a second-hand keyboard from a pawn shop downtown. It was missing 2 keys and the sound was slightly off, but to Kenzo, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He practiced every single day without anyone telling him. Toby, the time he was 7, he could play songs just by hearing them once on the radio. His teachers at school called him a prodigy, and his grandmother believed he was destined for greatness. She used to tell him that music chose him and that he had a responsibility to share his gift with the world. Those words stayed with him through his childhood and teenage years. He applied to one of the most prestigious music conservatories in the country when he was 19 years old. This was supposed to be the beginning of his dream coming true. He prepared for months, learning the most difficult classical pieces he could find. In the day of his audition, he played with everything he had, pouring his entire soul into every note. When he finished, he felt certain that he had done well. Judges sat in silence for a long moment, and then one of them spoke. They told him that while his technical skills were adequate, his playing lacked the emotional depth required for their program. Those words hit him like a punch to the chest. Walked out of that audition room a different person than when he walked in. Something inside him broke that day, and he never fully recovered. He stopped playing for 3 whole months after that rejection. When he finally touched the piano again, it was not to perform, but to fix. He got a job working for an old piano tuner who needed an assistant. Work was quiet and invisible, which suited Kenzo perfectly. Learned how to adjust the tiny hammers and strings inside pianos to make them sound perfect for other people. There was a strange comfort in this work. He could still be close to music without exposing himself to the pain of rejection again. Years passed and Kenzo became one of the most skilled piano tuners in his city. He moved to a bigger city when he was 25, chasing better opportunities in his trade. Chicago welcomed him with its cold winters and its legendary music scene. He found work easily because his reputation preceded him. Concert halls and recording studios and wealthy families all wanted him to take care of their instruments. He was invisible to them in the best possible way. They never asked him to play because they assumed a tuner was just a technician. Nobody knew that the man adjusting their pianos could probably outplay most of the performers who used them. Kenzo met his wife at a small coffee shop near one of his regular clients. Her name was Yuki, and she worked as a nurse at a nearby hospital. She noticed him because he was humming a complicated melody while waiting in line for his morning coffee. That humming led to a conversation, and that conversation led to many more. Within 2 years they were married. Yuki was the only person who truly understood what Kenzo had given up. She discovered his secret one night about 6 months into their marriage. She woke up at 3 in the morning and found his side of the bed empty. Following the faint sound of music, she walked downstairs to find him sitting at their small, upright piano. His eyes were closed, and his fingers were dancing across the keys, creating something so beautiful it made her catch her breath. She stood in the doorway watching him play for almost an hour. When he finally stopped, she asked him why he hid this from the world. He told her about the audition and the rejection and the shame he still carried. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she simply said that the judges were wrong. From that night forward, Yuki became his only audience. She would sometimes sit quietly in the corner of the room while he played his secret late-night concerts. She recorded him once on her phone without telling him and played it back for him the next morning. The look on his face when he heard himself was something she never forgot. For a moment she saw a flicker of the young dreamer he used to be before life convinced him to be small. But that flicker always faded quickly. Kenzo would shake his head and change the subject whenever she brought up performing again, told her that his time had passed and that he was too old now to start over. She disagreed, but she loved him too much to push. Years continued to roll by like waves on that coastal shore where he grew up. Kenzo turned 40 and then 45 and then 50. His hair started showing streaks of gray, and his hands developed small calluses from decades of delicate work. But those hands never forgot how to create magic. Every night after Yuki fell asleep, he would go downstairs and play. Sometimes he played classical pieces from memory, and sometimes he improvised something entirely new. The music that came out of him in those quiet hours was unlike anything most people would ever hear. It was raw and honest and deeply personal. But nobody, except Yuki, knew it existed. She kept asking him to share his gift, and he kept refusing. This push and pull became a gentle rhythm in their relationship. She would encourage him, and he would decline, and they would move on until the next time. Neither of them knew that everything was about to change. Kenzo was 52 years old when destiny finally caught up with him. He had spent more than half his life running from his own potential. He had convinced himself that he was meant to exist in the background, making other instruments sing while his own voice stayed silent. But life has a way of putting us exactly where we need to be at exactly the right moment. Sometimes it takes decades for that moment to arrive. For Kenzo, that moment was coming. It was coming in the form of an ordinary Tuesday evening in the middle of winter. He had no way of knowing that the next 24 hours would completely transform his life. He woke up that morning thinking it would be just another day of tuning pianos for people who would never know his secret. He kissed Yuki goodbye and headed out into the cold Chicago wind. The historic theater downtown had called him the day before, asking him to tune their grand piano before a sold-out concert that evening. It was a routine job that he had done dozens of times before. Nothing about that morning suggested that it would be anything other than ordinary. But sometimes the most extraordinary chapters of our lives begin on the most ordinary pages. Kenzo had no idea that by the time the sun set on that winter day, nothing would ever be the same again. His grandmother had told him decades ago that music chose him. He was finally about to discover just how right she was. The winter air bit into Kenzo's face as he walked toward the historic theater. That Tuesday afternoon, Chicago had been experiencing one of its coldest weeks in years, and the streets were covered in a thin layer of ice that made every step feel uncertain. He pulled his worn jacket tighter around his body and kept moving forward. Theater stood like a monument to another era, with its grand stone columns and intricate carvings that told stories of performances from 100 years ago. Kenzo had been inside this building many times, but he never stopped appreciating its beauty. There was something sacred about places where music had been played for generations. He entered through the service door on the side of the building like he always did. The warmth inside hit him immediately, and he felt his frozen fingers start to come back to life. Young woman at the front desk recognized him and waved him through without asking for identification. That was one benefit of doing this job for so many years. People knew his face, even if they never remembered his name. He made his way through the winding backstage corridors toward the main stage. The smell of old wood and velvet curtains filled his lungs. With every breath, crew members rushed past him carrying cables and equipment for the evening performance. Nobody paid him any attention, which was exactly how he preferred it. When he finally reached the stage, the sight of the grand piano made him Pause for just a moment, as a Steinway Model D, and it was one of the most beautiful instruments he had ever worked on. A black lacquer finish gleamed under the stage, lights like the surface of a still lake at midnight. He set down his tool bag and approached the piano with the same reverence a priest might show entering a cathedral. His hands touched the keys, gently feeling for any imperfections before he even played a single note. This was his ritual, and he never rushed through it. For the next 2 hours, Kenzo worked in complete concentration. He adjusted the tension of strings and aligned hammers and tested each key dozens of times until the sound was absolutely perfect. The crew members setting up around him occasionally glanced his way, but none of them understood what he was actually doing. To them, he was just a technician doing maintenance. They had no idea that his ears could detect differences in pitch that most professional musicians would miss by late afternoon. The piano was singing exactly the way it was meant. Kenzo played a few quiet chords to test his work and felt satisfied with the result. He began packing up his tools when he noticed something unusual happening backstage. A small group of people had gathered near the dressing rooms, and their voices carried an unmistakable tone of panic. Curiosity got the better of him, and he moved a little closer to hear what was happening. A woman in a headset was speaking rapidly into her phone, while two men in suits paced back and forth behind her. Someone mentioned an ambulance, and someone else mentioned food poisoning. Kenzo tried to piece together what was going on from the fragments of conversation floating through the air. Apparently, the opening act for tonight's concert was a young pianist who had gotten severely ill just an hour ago. He had been rushed to the hospital after collapsing in his dressing room. The situation was serious, and the show was supposed to start in less than 3 hours. 3,000 tickets had been sold, and people were already lining up outside in the freezing cold. Kenzo felt sympathy for whoever was in charge of solving this problem. He grabbed his tool bag and started walking toward the exit, thinking his work here was done. That was when the woman in the headset spotted him. She had seen him playing those test chords on the piano just minutes earlier. Her eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made him stop in his tracks. Before he could say anything, she was rushing toward him with desperation written all over her face. She introduced herself as the stage manager and asked him point blank if he could play piano. Kenzo felt his heart drop into his stomach. He tried to explain that he was just a tuner and that playing was not his job. She cut him off and said she had heard him testing the piano earlier. She said those few chords he played sounded better than most of the professional pianists who had performed on that stage. Kenzo shook his head and insisted she was mistaken. Told her he had not performed publicly in over 30 years. The stage manager grabbed his arm and led him away from the others so they could talk privately. Her eyes were red from stress, and he could see that she was on the verge of tears. She explained that the headlining act refused to go on without a proper opening performance, something about artistic integrity and the audience needing to be warmed up first. If they could not find someone to play for just 15 or 20 minutes, the entire concert would be canceled. 3,000 people would be turned away in the freezing cold. The theater would face lawsuits and refund demands that could cripple them financially. Dozens of crew members would lose their pay for the night. She asked him again if there was any way he could help. Kenzo felt the weight of her desperation pressing down on him. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to say no and walk away. He thought about the audition room from 33 years ago, and the judges who told him he was not good enough. He thought about all the years he had spent hiding from stages exactly like this one. His mouth opened to refuse, but no words came out. Stage manager must have sensed his hesitation because she pressed harder. She promised that nobody expected perfection from him. All he had to do was fill time until the main act was ready. The audience would be grateful for anything at this point. She said she would personally make sure he was paid triple his tuning fee for the trouble. Money was not what Kenzo was thinking about. He was thinking about Yuki and all those late-night conversations about wasted potential. He was thinking about his grandmother who died believing he would one day share his gift with the world. He was thinking about the 23-year-old version of himself who walked out of that audition room and never recovered. Something strange happened in that momenta. Voice inside his head that sounded remarkably like his grandmother whispered that this was his chance. This was the moment he had been running from his entire adult life. If he walked away now, he would spend the rest of his days wondering what might have been. The stage manager was still talking, but Kenzo had stopped listening. He looked past her toward the massive stage where the Steinway sat waiting under the lights. The piano he had just spent 2 hours perfecting was sitting there like an old friend inviting him to come closer. 3,000 empty seats stretched out into the darkness beyond the stage. In a few hours, those seats would be filled with people expecting to hear something beautiful. Kenzo thought about all the performers who had stood on this exact spot over the past century. Legends had played on that stage, and their music had echoed through this hall and touched the hearts of countless strangers. He had spent his whole life believing he did not belong among them, but maybe that belief was the real lie he had been telling himself. The stage manager grabbed his hand and asked him one more time. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, and Kenzo could see genuine tears forming in her eyes. He took a deep breath that felt like it lasted an entire lifetime. Then he heard himself say a single word that changed everything. Yes. The stage manager's face transformed from despair to disbelief to overwhelming relief in the span of 2 seconds. She hugged him so tightly that he nearly lost his balance before he could process what had just happened. She was dragging him toward the dressing rooms to get ready. Someone handed him a black jacket that was slightly too big for his shoulders. Someone else tried to do something with his graying hair that had not seen a stylist in years. The next 90 minutes passed in a blur of preparations and instructions and growing terror. Kenzo called Yuki from a borrowed phone and told her what was happening. The silence on the other end of the line stretched on for so long he thought the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was trembling. She told him she was proud of him, no matter what happened tonight. She told him to close his eyes when he got on stage and pretend he was playing just for her, like he did every night at home. Those words anchored him when nothing else could. Outside the theater, 3,000 people filed through the doors, shaking snow from their coats and finding their seats. None of them knew that the man about to play for them had not performed publicly since they were children. None of them knew that the simple piano tuner, who had been invisible to everyone, was about to step into the spotlight for the first time in 3 decades. Kenzo stood in the wings of the stage, listening to the growing murmur of the crowd. His hands were shaking so badly he had to press them against his legs to keep them still. In just a few minutes, he would walk out onto that stage and sit down at the piano he had just tuned. He had no sheet music and no prepared pieces and no idea what he was going to play. All he had was 33 years of hidden practice and a lifetime of unspoken music living inside his heart. The stage manager appeared beside him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. She told him it was time. Kenzo closed his eyes and thought of Yuki and his grandmother and every dream he had ever abandoned. Then he took his first step toward the light. The distance from the wings to the piano felt like the longest walk of Kenzo's entire existence. Each step echoed against the polished wooden floor, and he could feel 3,000 pairs of eyes following his every movement. The stage lights were blinding and hot against his skin, making it impossible to see individual faces in the audience. This was probably a blessing, because if he could see them clearly, he might have turned around and run. His worn work boots looked ridiculous against the elegant stage floor. Everyone else who performed here wore expensive dress shoes that cost more than his entire wardrobe. Was acutely aware that the black jacket someone had given him was too large and hung awkwardly on his shoulders. Nothing about his appearance said professional performer. Everything about him screamed ordinary man who had wandered onto the wrong stage. The Steinway waited for him like a patient friend who had been expecting his arrival for decades. He reached the piano bench and stood there for a moment, unsure if his legs would support him if he tried to sit down. A small cough from somewhere in the front rows reminded him that thousands of people were waiting. He lowered himself onto the bench and felt the familiar smoothness of the wood beneath him. His fingers hovered above the keys, trembling visibly in the bright lights. The audience grew completely silent. That silence was somehow more terrifying than any noise. Could have been it pressed against his ears, like a physical weight demanding that he fill it with something worthy. Kenzo tried to remember the classical pieces he had memorized as a teenager. Beethoven and Chopin and Mozart swirled through his mind like leaves in a windstorm, but when he reached for them, they slipped away before he could grasp them. 33 years without performing had erased his ability to recall anything under pressure. His mind was completely and utterly blank. Panic started rising in his chest like water filling a sinking ship. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead and his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. This was a mistake. This was the biggest mistake of his entire life. He should never have said yes to the desperate stage manager. He should have walked out of this theater and gone home to his quiet life where he belonged. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as he sat frozen at the piano. He heard someone in the audience whisper something to their neighbor. The sound cut through the silence like a knife, and Kenzo felt his face flush with humiliation. They were already judging him. They could already tell he did not belong here. His hands dropped to his lap in defeat, and he seriously considered standing up and walking off the stage. Would rather face the embarrassment of leaving than the devastation of failing in front of all these strangers. But then something unexpected happened. A memory floated up from somewhere deep inside him. It was not a memory of a classical masterpiece or a complicated sonata. It was something much simpler and much older. He remembered being 4 years old and sitting on his grandmother's lap. In their small house by the ocean, she was humming a melody that her own mother had taught her back in the old country. It was a lullaby with only 8 notes that repeated in a gentle pattern. She used to sing it to him every night before bed. The sound of it meant safety and love and home. Kenzo had not thought about that lullaby in years, but in this moment of complete desperation, it came back to him as clearly as if his grandmother was sitting beside him. Without making a conscious decision, his fingers found the keys. He began to play those 8 simple notes. The sound that came out of the Steinway was soft and almost apologetic. It filled the massive theater with a melody so basic that a child could learn it in an afternoon. Kenzo heard a few confused murmurs ripple through the audience. This was not what they had paid to hear. They had come expecting virtuoso performances and technical brilliance. Instead, they were getting a lullaby that sounded like something from a beginner's piano. But the shame that washed over him was almost unbearable. He felt like a fraud who had been exposed in front of thousands of witnesses. His fingers stumbled slightly on the 4th repetition of the melody, and he heard someone in the crowd let out a small sigh. That sigh contained disappointment and maybe even pity. Part of him wanted to stop right there and accept his failure. He had tried, and he was not good enough, just like those judges told him 3 decades ago. They were right about him all along, but another part of him refused to give up. It was the part that still played every night after Yuki fell asleep. Part that had been creating music in secret for over 20 years. That part of him whispered that he had nothing left to. Lucy had already embarrassed himself with this simple melody. He might as well see where it wanted to go. Kenzo closed his eyes and let his fingers continue playing the 8 notes. But this time he stopped trying to control them. He stopped worrying about what the audience thought. He stopped hearing the murmurs and the sighs. He let himself sink into the memory of his grandmother's voice and the smell of salt air and the feeling of being completely safe. The melody began to shift almost on its own. His left hand started adding deeper notes beneath the simple pattern. A harmony emerged that he had never consciously planned it. was as if the music had been living inside him all these years, just waiting for permission to come out. The 8 notes were still there at the center of everything, but now they were surrounded by waves of sound that rose and fell like the ocean near his childhood home. Kenzo felt something unlock in his chest. A door that had been sealed shut for 33 years finally cracked open. Behind the door was every emotion he had been too afraid to express: the grief of losing his grandmother before she could see him perform, the pain of that rejection letter that changed the course of his life, the loneliness of being surrounded by music every day while hiding his ability to create it, the love he felt for Yuki, who had believed in him when he could not believe in himself. All of these feelings poured through his fingers and into the piano. The simple lullaby became something else entirely. It became a conversation between who he used to be and who he had become. Child who played without fear, and the man who had learned to be afraid. They met somewhere in the middle of those 8 notes, and finally made peace with each other. Kenzo was no longer aware of the audience or the stage, or the too large jacket hanging off his shoulders. It was somewhere else entirely. He was in his grandmother's kitchen watching her cook while music played from an old radio. He was in the audition room hearing those crushing words for the first time. He was in the hospital waiting room when the doctors told him she was gone. He was in his living room playing for Yuki in the middle of the night while she pretended to be asleep. Every moment that had shaped him was flowing through the music now. Melody twisted and climbed and dipped in ways that surprised even him. Had no idea what he was going to play from one measure to the next. Each note revealed itself only when his fingers touched the keys. This was not a performance. This was a confession. It was every truth he had ever been too scared to speak out loud, finally finding its voice. The piano sang with an honesty that felt almost painful. The lullaby was still there underneath everything, like a heartbeat that never stopped, but it had grown into something much larger than 8 simple notes. It had become a story that words could never tell. Kenzo did not know how long he had been playing when he finally became aware of the audience again. His eyes were still closed, but he could feel something different in the air. The confused murmurs had stopped completely. The silence that surrounded him now was not the demanding silence from before. This was something else. This was the silence of people who had stopped breathing because they did not want to miss a single note. Could feel their attention pressing against him like warmth from a fire. Somewhere in the middle of his simple melody turned extraordinary. The audience had stopped judging him. They had stopped expecting him to be something he was not. Instead, they were simply listening. They were letting his music wash over them and carry them wherever it wanted to go. Kenzo realized in that moment that he had spent his whole life being afraid of the wrong thing. He had been afraid of rejection and judgment and not being good enough. But the real tragedy would have been never sharing this part of himself at all. His grandmother knew that from the very beginning. Music chose him for a reason, not because he was technically perfect or classically trained or impressive on paper, but because he had something inside him that needed to be heard. The lullaby continued to build towards something Kenzo could feel but not yet see. He did not know where it was taking him. He only knew that he was finally ready to follow. The music had taken on a life of its own, and Kenzo was no longer playing the piano. The piano was playing him. His fingers moved across the keys with a certainty he had never experienced before in his entire life. Every note knew exactly where it wanted to go, and he was simply following along for the ride. The simple lullaby had become an ocean of sound that filled every corner of the massive theater. It crashed against the walls and swirled around the fonda chandeliers and wrapped itself around every person sitting in those 3,000 seats. Kenzo added jazz harmonies that his hands remembered from decades of secret midnight sessions. The classical training from his youth wove itself through the melody like threads of gold in a tapestry. Everything he had ever learned and felt and dreamed was pouring out of him in waves that he could not have stopped even if he wanted to the crescendo built slowly at first like distant thunder rolling across the plains. His left hand began hammering out bass notes that shook the floor beneath the audience's feet. The sound was so powerful the people in the front rows could feel it vibrating in their chests. Then just when it seemed like the music could not get any bigger, Kenzo pulled everything back to almost nothing. The contrast was so sudden and so complete that several people in the audience gasped out loud. He returned to the 8 simple notes of his grandmother's lullaby, that now those notes carried the weight of everything that had come before them. They floated through the silence like feathers drifting down from the sky. An elderly woman in the 5th row felt tears streaming down her face without understanding why. A businessman who had come to the concert straight from a stressful day at work found himself thinking about his mother who had passed away the previous spring. Teenage girl sitting with her parents suddenly remembered a song her grandfather used to hum when she was small. The music was reaching into people's hearts and pulling out memories they had forgotten. They still carried. This was not entertainment. This was something much deeper and much more real. Kenzo built the melody back up again, layer by layer. His right hand danced across the upper keys, creating patterns that sparkled like stars appearing one by one in a darkening sky. The harmonies shifted from minor to major and back, again taking the audience on an emotional journey that words could never describe. Some passages were so achingly beautiful that people found themselves holding their breath. Other moments burst with such explosive joy that strangers sitting next to each other exchanged looks of wonder. Nobody was checking their phones or whispering to their neighbors or thinking about what they would do after the concert. Every single person in that theater was completely and totally present. The stage manager stood in the wings with her hand pressed against her mouth. Tears were running down her cheeks, and she had given up trying to wipe them away. She had worked in this theater for 15 years and had seen hundreds of performers on that stage world. Famous pianists and legendary orchestras and musicians, whose names everyone knew, but she had never witnessed anything like what was happening right now. The man she had begged to fill 15 minutes of time had been playing for almost half an hour, and nobody wanted him to stop. The main act was standing beside her, watching through a gap in the curtain. He was a celebrated pianist who had performed in concert halls around the globe. His face showed an expression that mixed admiration with something that might have been envy. He leaned over to the stage manager and whispered that he had no idea how he was supposed to follow this. Kenzo knew nothing of what was happening off stage, was lost in a world that existed only between himself and the piano. The instrument responded to his every intention as if it could read his thoughts. This was the Steinway he had spent 2 hours tuning to absolute perfection. Now it was repaying him by becoming an extension of his own soul. He thought about his grandmother and played the gratitude he never got to express before she died. Thought about the judges who rejected him and played the pain that had never fully healed. He thought about all the years he spent hiding and played the loneliness of keeping such a big part of himself secret. He thought about Yuki and played the love that filled his heart. Every time he looked at her, each emotion became music, and each piece of music became a gift he was offering to the strangers who had gathered to hear him. The performance reached its peak with a passage so intense that Kenzo's entire body was swaying with the effort. Sweat dripped from his forehead onto the keys, but he did not notice or care. His fingers flew across the piano faster than should have been humanly possible. The sound was overwhelming and magnificent, and almost too much to bear. Then, with perfect instincts, he brought everything to a gentle close. The final notes were the same 8 from his grandmother's lullaby. They rang out one by one, soft and pure and full of peace. Last note hung in the air for what felt like an eternity before finally fading into silence. Kenzo's hands came to rest on his lap. His eyes were still closed, and his chest was heaving from the physical exertion of what he had just done. The silence that followed was the most profound quiet he had ever experienced. For a moment, he was terrified that he had made a terrible mistake. Maybe the audience hated what they had heard. Maybe they were sitting there in stunned disappointment, wondering what had just happened. He could not bring himself to open his eyes and face the truth. Then the silence broke. It started with a single person clapping somewhere in the back of the theater. That one pair of hands was quickly joined by another, and then another. Within seconds, the entire audience was applauding. But this was not polite appreciation clapping. This was something explosive and overwhelming. People were rising from their seats, one section at a time, until every single person in the theater was standing. The sound of 3,000 people clapping and cheering crashed over Kenzo like a tidal wave. He finally opened his eyes, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The entire audience was on their feet. Many of them were crying openly, without any embarrassment. Others were shouting words he could not make out over the thunderous applause. Some people had their hands raised above their heads, clapping with an intensity that seemed almost desperate. They were not just appreciating his music, they were thanking him for giving them something they did not know they needed. Kenzo sat frozen at the piano, unable to process what was happening. This was so far beyond anything he had imagined that his brain simply could not accept it as real. He looked down at his hands resting on his lap, and they seemed to belong to someone else. These were the same hands that had spent 30 years tuning pianos for other people, the same hands that had played in secret every night while the world slept. Now 3,000 strangers were standing and crying and cheering for what those hands had created. The applause continued for 1 minute, and then 2, and then 3. It showed no signs of stopping. People in the front rows were reaching toward the stage as if they wanted to touch. And Kenzo felt something wet on his own face and realized that he was crying too. He had not cried in public since his grandmother's funeral, but now the tears were flowing freely, and he did not try to hide them. The stage manager rushed out from the wings and wrapped her arms around him in a tight embrace. She was sobbing against his shoulder and repeating, "Thank you," over and over. He patted her back awkwardly, not knowing what else to do. When she finally released him, she gestured for him to stand and acknowledged the audience. Kenzo rose on shaky legs and faced the sea of standing people. He gave a small bow that felt inadequate for the moment. The applause somehow grew even louder. He bowed again, deeper this time. Still, the ovation continued. 5 full minutes passed before people finally began to sit back down. Even then, the energy in the room was electric. With wonder, Kenzo walked off the stage in a daze. His legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Crew members he had never met before were patting his back and shaking his hand. Everyone was talking at once, and none of their words made sense. To him, he found a quiet corner backstage and leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. His phone was buzzing in his pocket. Pulled it out and saw 17 missed calls from Yuki. His hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 attempts to call her back. When she answered, her voice was thick with emotion. She told him that someone in the audience had started streaming his performance online. Thousands of people were already watching and sharing it across the internet. She said she had seen the whole thing on her phone at home. She said she had never been more proud of anyone in her entire life. Kenzo slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor. He pressed the phone against his ear and listened to his wife cry happy tears. Neither of them could find the right words to say, but the silence between them was full of everything that mattered. The simple melody that his grandmother taught him 50 years ago had just changed his life forever, and the world was only beginning to notice. Kenzo did not sleep that night. He lay in bed next to Yuki, staring at the ceiling while his phone buzzed with notifications every few seconds. By midnight, the video of his performance had been viewed over 100,000 times. By 3 in the morning, that number had jumped to 500,000 when the sun finally rose over Chicago. The view count had crossed 2 million and showed no signs of slowing down. People from all over the world were watching a 52-year-old piano tuner pour his heart Out on a stage he never expected to stand on, the comments section was flooded with messages that made Kenzo's eyes water every time he scrolled through them. Strangers were sharing how his music had made them think of loved ones they had lost. Others wrote about how they had given up on their own dreams years ago, and his story was making them reconsider some. People simply typed that they had cried for the first time in years. While watching him play, Kenzo did not know how to process any of this. He had spent 3 decades convincing himself that his music was not worth sharing. Now millions of people were telling him he was wrong. The phone calls started coming before breakfast. First, it was local news stations wanting to interview the mystery pianist who had gone viral overnight. Then national morning shows reached out asking if he could fly to New York or Los Angeles to appear on their programs. By noon, his voicemail was completely full, and emails were piling up faster than he could count them. Concert venues from around the country sent invitations for him to perform. Music producers left messages offering to help him record an album. A literary agent called asking if he would be interested in writing a book about his life. The attention was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at the same time. Yuki took the day off work to help him navigate the chaos. She sat beside him on their small couch, answering calls and taking notes while he tried to wrap his head around what was happening. Every few minutes she would grab his hand and squeeze it, just to remind him that this was real. He was not dreaming. This was actually his life now. Story that captured people's hearts was not just about the music, it was about a man who had hidden his gift for 33 years because someone once told him he was not good enough. It was about second chances and buried dreams and the courage to try again when everything inside you says to stay safe. People saw themselves in Kenzo's journey. They saw their own abandoned passions and forgotten talents and roads not taken. His performance became a mirror that reflected back all the things they wished they had been brave enough to pursue. A week after the concert, Kenzo agreed to do his first television interview. He was nervous in a way that felt different from the stage fright he had experienced before. Playing piano was one thing, but sitting in front of cameras and talking about himself was something else entirely. Yuki helped him pick out a simple outfit and drove him to the studio. She waited in the green room while he sat across from the interviewer under bright lights that made him squint. Host asked him to describe what went through his mind when he walked onto that stage. Kenzo thought for a moment before answering. He said that he was terrified and that his mind went completely blank. He said that the only reason he started playing his grandmother's lullaby was because he could not remember anything else. He said that closing his eyes and letting go was the scariest thing he had ever done. But it was also the moment when he finally stopped running from himself. The interview aired that evening and brought another wave of attention. More invitations arrived from concert halls and festivals and television programs. Record labels sent representatives to meet with him in person. Everyone wanted a piece of the piano tuner who had touched millions of hearts with a simple melody. Kenzo took his time, making decisions about what came next. He was not interested in rushing into anything just because the world was suddenly paying attention. He had waited 52 years for this moment, and he was not going to waste it by making choices that did not feel right. After much discussion with Yuki, he accepted an invitation to perform at a small concert hall in his hometown by the ocean. This felt like the right way to begin his new chapter. He wanted to play in the place where his grandmother first noticed his gift. He wanted to honor her memory in the town where she taught him that lullaby so many years ago. The concert sold out within hours of the announcement. People traveled from across the country to attend. News crews set up cameras outside the venue, hoping to capture the moment. Kenzo arrived early and walked along the beach where he used to play as a child. The sound of the waves brought back memories so vivid that he could almost see his grandmother walking beside him. He whispered a thank you to her spirit and promised that he would never hide again. That evening, he took the stage in front of an audience that included childhood friends and former neighbors and complete strangers who had driven hundreds of miles. He played for almost 2 hours without stopping. The performance included classical pieces he had loved as a teenager and jazz improvisations he had developed during his secret midnight sessions, but he opened and closed with the same 8-note lullaby that had started everything. When the final note faded, the audience rose to their feet just like they had in Chicago. Kenzo bowed deeply and felt tears rolling down his cheeks for the second time in front of a crowd. This time, he did not feel any shame about crying, felt only gratitude for being given a second chance of the life he was always meant to live. The months that followed brought more changes than Kenzo could have ever imagined. He recorded his first album in a professional studio with musicians who had been inspired by his viral video. The album debuted at the top of the classical charts and stayed there for weeks. Music critics praised his unique style that blended technical skill with raw, emotional honesty. Concert offers came from cities he had only ever seen in photographs. He performed in Tokyo and London and Paris and Sydney. Each audience greeted him with the same warmth and wonder he had first experienced in Chicago. But fame and success were not what mattered most to Kenzo. What mattered was that he finally felt complete. The hole that had existed inside him for 33 years was finally filled. He no longer woke up in the middle of the night feeling like something was missing. He no longer looked at pianos with a mixture of love and regret. He was finally living the life his grandmother always knew he was meant to live. Through all of it, Yuki remained by his side. She traveled with him to every concert and sat in the front row at every performance. She was his anchor when the attention became overwhelming, and his cheerleader when self-doubt crept back, and he dedicated his album to her and to his grandmother, the two women who believed in him when he could not believe in himself. 1 year after that fateful Tuesday in Chicago, Kenzo returned to the same theater where everything began. They invited him back to perform a solo concert that would be broadcast around the world. The stage manager who had begged him to play was still working there. She greeted him backstage with a hug that lasted almost a full minute. She told him that he had saved her job that night and probably saved the entire theater. He told her that she had soul by asking him to try before the concert started. Kenzo asked for a moment alone on stage. He walked out to the same Steinway he had tuned that winter afternoon. He sat down on the bench and placed his hands on the keys. The theater was empty and quiet. He closed his eyes and played the 8 notes of his grandmother's lullaby one more time. He could feel her presence with him. In that moment, he whispered that he hoped she was proud of the man he had finally become. Then he stood up and walked back toward the wings to prepare for the performance. The audience would be arriving soon. 3,000 seats would fill with people who wanted to hear his music, but Kenzo no longer felt afraid of that spotlight. He had learned that the greatest tragedy in life is not failure or rejection. The greatest tragedy is never trying at all. He had spent 33 years hiding from his own potential. Now he was going to spend however many years he had left sharing it with the world. Sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the simplest steps. For Kenzo, that step was an 8-note lullaby taught to him by a grandmother who saw magic in a 3-year-old boy playing an old broken piano. She was right about him all along. Music had chosen him, and he had finally chosen it back.